Grace and peace be with you on this day. In Greek mythology, there is a character by the name of Pan. He's a god, and this god is a very intriguing god, not as good-looking as many of the other Greek gods. Pan is half human and half beast. His legs are those of a goat, and it resembles an ugly goat in that respect. Many images of Pan throughout the centuries have Pan being very joyful and happy playing a flute. But in reality, Pan is a tormented soul that torments others. Often Pan is a symbol of fertility, and he is depicted as aroused or as copulating with other goats. And very wild. His voice is a voice that promotes panic in those that listen. So consequently, the word panic is derived from his name. The god Pan is a metaphorical representation of the human condition. And I'm sure those Greek authors back in that day had a lot of fun in creating this semi-demigod. Half beast, representing our animalistic and violent tendencies that are innate in so many humans. But the other half is the more virtuous half, the half of us wanting to, that we strive for, that brings us closer to God. There were no temples built in honor of Pan, but plenty of an altar were carved on the side of cave walls, on the side of cliff walls, in forest. And the followers of Pan were a rowdy bunch. They were a group of people that went out and reveled in all that fertility myth that surrounded them. And they had festivities that were full of lechery and debauchery. No temples were also built in honor of Pan, because more temples were built in honor of Apollo or Athena, the more virtuous gods. But Caesarea Philippi was one of those areas that were used to celebrate the god Pan. Herod Philippi, the son of Herod the Great, built that city as a Roman destination, as a getaway place, so that those first century Romans could have a vacation, a Las Vegas of sorts, where whatever happens in Caesarea Philippi stays in Caesarea Philippi. And it is in that area that also many things that were abhorrent to human nature, and I was talking to Keith about it before. He reminded me that human sacrifices were also done there in Caesarea Philippi. And it was very well known throughout the region. And it is important to note this because the authors of the gospel, for them it was common knowledge. And today's gospel passage starts almost in a very casual reference, and as they went to Caesarea Philippi, almost as if saying as they ventured to the nearby villages. But 2 millennia later and half around the world, we have no clue what the common knowledge is. And so we have to do a little bit of research into the context. And Herod Philippi built this destination area because he wanted to increase his favor with Rome, and went ahead and built also an altar in honor of Caesar, who had proclaimed himself the Son of God. And there they had many pagan rituals and many pagan festivities, and no good Jew would ever find himself there. And Jesus, being a good Jew, it brings up the question, what was Jesus doing there? What exactly was Jesus doing in that region with his disciples? And the Gospels have that setting for him to pose that question, specifically the question of, who do people say that I am? And who do you say I am? And this was a very important question. It's a very human question, if you think about it. Most executive CEOs are always asking that question, or of their product. What do people say about our product? Or many presidential candidates now are going around wondering what the pollsters are saying about them. And in a more daily life, in a more communal life, we ask that of each other, wondering what our neighbors say of us. Do they consider us to be good neighbors? Young couples in love are always wondering if their affections are being received as well as they're being given. And who do people say that we are, and what you say I am is a very human need to know. It shows the humanness of Jesus at that time. But it's a question that has stayed with us. It's a question that has stayed with the church. And invariably, the church has been answering that question in a variety of forms. And different denominations have arisen because they answer the question differently. We all have common ground that we stand on, and for the most part, we're all saying the same thing. But I have found that there are other Christians that answer the question differently. They put a limit on and a barrier on the answer to that question. In some form or another, we think the answer is the same, but then all of a sudden we hit a glass wall. When all of a sudden, from this point on, I don't feel as welcomed as I used to be. The answer to the question is one that has changed over the millennia and in time has led to a joke. And it's a joke I imagine you've already heard because it's an old joke. It's a familiar joke, and I'm sure that maybe Keith has already said it from this pulpit. But I want you to laugh like if you heard it for the first time. And when people are wondering about Jesus, there's people who say that Jesus was Italian. There's proof that he was Italian because he always spoke with his hands, he always had wine with his meals, and he was always eating olives and cooking with olive oil. Jesus was a Californian. He never cut his hair, he walked barefoot, and he started a new religion. Jesus was Irish because he never got married. He liked to tell stories, and he loved the green pastures. But all jokes aside, who do we say Jesus is a very important question for us. And often we sometimes struggle with the historical and the literal. We struggle with what's in the Bible and what happens to be the context of his day. We struggle with doctrine and tradition, and we struggle with what is relevant and pertinent. And who Jesus is for me, I know varies with every person in this room and with every person in previous generations. But invariably, this church has to answer that question. Who is Jesus? Who do we say Jesus is? Peter answered it very well. He answered it so well that he received a compliment from Jesus. He said, "You are the Son of the living God." Emphasis on the word living. Because going back to the context, where were they standing? Behind them was Mount Hermon. At the base of Mount Hermon was the cliff wall, and on that cliff wall, the carvings for the god Pan, an altar there carved, and for Caesar, the son of God, were all carved there. But Plutarch, the philosopher and historian in first century, had already declared Pan to be dead. And most likely, he wanted that in order to promote the more virtuous teachings of Plato and of Pythagoras. But the followers of Jesus were following a living God, a God that was pertinent and relevant to them and to their community, bringing a word of hope to a people who were oppressed not only by the Roman Empire, but also by the ruling religious institution of this day. For those of you who might share with me a certain musical taste, if you're fans of Bruce Springsteen, you'll recognize the sermon title, "A Brilliant Disguise." This is a song that Bruce wrote, and in that song, he raises the same question, but in a different way, in a way that's a little bit more cool for a rock and roll singer. There, Bruce wants to know if what he sees is real. He's asking the subject of his song if what he sees is truly real. Is that you, baby, or just a brilliant disguise? Today is an important day, as I said earlier, because today is the day that we ask that question of each other. I am interested to know who you say I am, and I'm sure you are interested to know who I say you are. Because we all have done our homework. You had your search committee, and your search committee called my references and looked me up and saw my sermons online. And I asked around too about that wonderful little church at the beach. And who we say we are is pertinent, but more importantly, the church needs to ask that question of itself. And the church universal, not just at Pass-A-Grille, but our entire progressive denomination of the United Church of Christ needs to ask that question, who do people say we are? And who do you say the church is? In the scripture passage read so nicely by Linda, did you notice the turnaround for Peter? Did you notice that Peter at one moment was being blessed, and then at the next moment he was being rebuked? Get away from me, Satan. At one moment he was the rock of the church, and at the next moment he's going to have to pick up his own cross in order to become a follower of Jesus. And the gospel author has to be questioned at this moment. Why was that placed there? Why that juxtaposition? Is he giving us a clue that Jesus might suffer from a bipolar disorder? Most likely not. But there is something there that just doesn't quite seem to jive until you consider that possibly one is the answer for the question posed earlier. Here lies the answer of the question. Who we say we are and who we say Jesus is becomes evident when we pick up our cross. The saying, we all have our own cross to bear, was a saying that was actually my mother's favorite saying. And, my mother at every one point or another would talk about that she had her cross to bear. And my brother and I, we would look at each other thinking, oh my God, I hope she doesn't mean it's us. And in time we found out that that's exactly what she meant. But we all have our own cross to bear, and it's an important lesson to keep in mind, to have some empathy, that no one life is perfect, as perfectly it presented it might be. And I know that as a society, we're very good at putting on a face, at putting on that brilliant disguise, and not letting others know our pain, not letting others know what are the things that that others might call a dysfunction, or that some people might call a limitation. In reality, though, knowing that we all have our cross to bear creates that sense of we're in it together. And that's the beauty of church. The beauty of church is that no one person is left alone to bear the burden of their own cross. They can lean on us. We can stand together. We can join our hands and join our efforts to help each other. And when a church member has a beloved in the hospital, to know that members of the church are going over to visit, to know that people are passing by and asking about that beloved who's ill, somehow or another just helps that burden be eased. At the individual level, there are many different burdens that we may carry. But there's also burdens and a cross that we carry at the communal level. As a community, what is it that Pass-A-Grille is being faced with? What is it that Pass-A-Grille is having to lift, and that we may want to have to partner with other churches because this church cannot do it all by itself? Invariably also, it's how we live our lives. It's how we have the day-to-day that answers the question of who we say Jesus is. And mind you, people are watching. People are listening. People are asking the question of us to see how it is that we answer. First-time visitors to this church are wondering who we say Jesus is. Are we going to give that evangelical response that may have turned them off when they were younger? Or are we going to present a new progressive and modern version of Jesus? Are we going to present a Jesus that's more welcoming? Are we going to present an aspect of the divine that they can connect with? Or will it be nothing but a bunch of traditions and doctrines that we just say but really don't mean anything? How we answer the question is also seen in how we bear the cross. Jesus is connecting the two in this Gospel of Matthew. Who do you say I am? And it's not until you bear the cross that you could follow me. I dare say that with refugee children drowning and washing ashore, I'd say that we still have a cross to bear. That with racial issues still being part of our landscape, I'd say we still have a cross to bear. Even though we may have passed marriage equality, with discrimination and bigotry being applauded on TV, I'd say we still have a cross to bear. With families being torn apart by societal ills, I'd say we still have a cross to bear. My favorite theologian, Marcus Borg, who passed away not too long ago, actually wrote about this in his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. And there, Dr. Borg says that we need to make this question, who do we say Jesus is, relevant and pertinent to a new generation that is looking at us and not really quite sure what it is that we're saying. We might think we're being intelligible, but the new generation is really not quite listening. We might say we're loud and clear, but the new generation just hears blah, blah, blah. We might know that the answer is very clear, but the new generation doesn't really quite get it. Dr. Borg talks about having a Jesus that is relevant and pertinent to today. And that can only happen if the church asks itself that question. If the church is willing to ask itself, who do people say we are? Ask that question of its religious institutions, of its sacred cows, of those doctrines that need to be rewritten but are not. My friends, the followers of Pan are all around us. The followers of Pan are still with us. They just have a different disguise. The followers of Pan are all around us, but the work of the church is still the same. The work of the church never ceases. For the cross of injustice still needs to be lifted up. The cross of discrimination and bigotry still needs to be lifted up. The cross of inequity still needs to be lifted up. The cross is at our feet. And we must join our hands and join our efforts to lift it. For then, and only then, will others know exactly who we are. We are the followers of Christ. Amen.